Welcome to the HR Dialogues, a show where we talk about HR and the future of work. I'm your host, Dr. Veldsman, and today I'm joined by Ed Brzychcy. I'm very excited for our conversation about adaptive strategy and what that means. Strategy, I think, is one of those words that always gets thrown around quite a lot in a lot of contexts, but it means various different things for different people. So, welcome to the HR Dialogues, where we learn from people practitioners as they navigate the emerging world of work. Before we jump in, Ed, what was the best piece of career advice that you've ever received?
Best piece of career advice was advice from a very long time ago, was be secure in yourself. And sometimes the worst enemy is for you to compare yourself to others. But as long as you're doing better than you were yesterday, then watching that growth just helps so much.
What makes you passionate about the leadership and the HR field?
I joined this from probably a very untraditional background. My past life was with the military and grew up serving with the U.S. Army. And then after about 12 years of service, was retired and found myself going back to school and completing my college degrees. And then I had enough of yes sir, no sir. And I looked and I trained, led, and developed people for 12 years of my life. And, how can I help organizations do that? And I started going around and asking, hey, how can I help you with your leaders? How can I help build people in your organization? And in the ensuing decade, I've very much made that into a much more strategic practice where I've been able to grow it to not only be able to help people develop their leaders, but develop the culture and develop the organizations in order to excel in, like you said, such an uncertain environment today.
No, absolutely love that. And I think it's always amazing for me, the diverse backgrounds that people have and the commonalities of life lessons that they then can either bring back to the organizational environment or take into other spheres of life. And I've seen some of your other talks and things that you've done, and I've always thought you bring a very unique perspective, which I hope that we can really deep dive into today a little bit more as well. Ed, to get us started, let's start with the big question around adaptive strategy. What does that actually mean, and how do we make that simple and break that down for us?
Oh, certainly. Adaptive strategy for me is we know where we're going, but we need to know also how are we getting there. And the adaptive piece comes in is we have our frameworks, we have our operations, we have the way we work, but it is a cycle of continuous and iterative improvement so that we're constantly adapting, we're constantly evolving and getting better at approaching that final end state, that value proposition, that go-to-market, whatever it is that we're trying to create. We're understanding and adjusting for the consistent bumps in the road that we will inevitably encounter.
I want to double click a little bit on that, because when I speak to a lot of HR leaders and business leaders, I think strategy, a lot of us still associate that with, this vision at the end of the rainbow, that it's going to take 5 years, 8 years, 10 years to get there. And then playing devil's advocate, most people say, 2 years ago, we weren't even talking about anything like generative artificial intelligence. How is strategy still relevant today? So help me convince the listeners today that adaptive strategy is still something to invest in.
Oh, no, absolutely. When we look at strategy, we think for a lot of executive teams, we see, here's our 5-year plan. Here's what we want to have that 3-day workshop to get us there. And it's one thing to say, here's where we're going to go, and here's being able to well articulate and understand the value that we create in our marketplaces and the overall directions for our businesses. The richer part of strategy for me is always the implementation phase. And we know where we want to go, and we're very good at coming up with and doing our analyses and going into all of the robust frameworks around strategy and understanding our situation, where we're going. But the challenge in implementation is this is absolutely a moving target, and the journey, it needs to become adaptable. And so being able to integrate into our strategies the implementation side of it. How do we actually make it happen? How do we adjust for the inevitable changes that we're going to see? How do we convince, after we come up with this as an executive team, how do we bring the rest of the organization into it, especially if we're going to be doing pivots and changes to some of their daily lives and routines? And building the people element and building that adaptive element is what enriches a strategy and primes an organization for success.
Mm. So, Ed, I've always thought about it, and I think you're spot on, right, when you mentioned around implementation, is that there's almost these phases that we think about in strategy, right? There's almost the setting phase or the design phase or the articulation phase. There's the execution phase that sits on the other side, but in between, there's this translation phase that I think a lot of people really struggle with and don't get right. And that's how do we take the 3-pager that's on the slide deck into what it is actually that we are going to be able to do. Can you share a little bit with us there? I love the way that you talk about the fact that it is about preparing, but also being adaptable with the moving target. But how do we do that translation piece better?
Oh, certainly. No, the implementation phase, the execution phase it's the hardest part of strategy. And you see so many pieces come out where the research is there, where most strategic objectives, most long-term strategies don't meet their initial goals or what they stated. And it's always on implementation. It's always on execution. The challenge, honestly, is people. We're very good at being objective and analytical. We're very good at understanding our markets, understanding our industries, doing the deep dive into the competitive analysis or any of those pieces that we're going to learn in B school strategy class, in business school strategy. How do we bring that to the people? How do we organize our teams? How do we create the processes for people to use in order to create the value that they create so that the organization can achieve that value that it creates? It takes a much more iterative approach. It takes a much more individual approach. It's understanding not only the mission, the goals, the tools of the organization, but how are people using them? How do people tie themselves and see themselves in the organization? How do we build, as executives, we're often very passionate about what we do, but we have teams of people underneath us and teams of people in our organizations that we have to share that with. And set that tone and set that culture.
I love the comment that you made around, when we think about implementation, culture plays such a critical role. And, a lot of people listening, and myself included, that comes from an HR background, we would love to say that we think culture is even more important than strategy, and it's the vehicle and the means to be able to get strategy to be implemented successfully. Can you share a bit in terms of your perspective and your view there around the importance of culture whenever we talk about strategy?
No, thank you, Dieter. Happy to. Culture, it's such an important piece. I don't buy into the idea that culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's an old cliche, and honestly, you really need both in your organization. You need to have the direction, the purpose, and you need to have the means to get there. And the culture what helps support that. The challenge I see a lot of people get around culture is understanding that it's an end state. So culture is something that you create over time. And being able to say, we're an innovative company, we're collaborative, we have these values. The culture of our organization is how we act on that. It's not just what we say, but it's how we do, how we act, and how we set the tone of the organization. When I come into a company and I see those values and they're the poster on the break room wall, wonderful. How do people actually act and how are they living them? And so being able to have those exemplars in the organization, being able to have those leaders that provide the example, that espouse those values that people can then mirror and act on and grow, that's truly the emotional intelligence and the resonant leadership that we want to see, that creates positive culture, that enables people to be collaborative, that enables the tone for us to be innovative.
I mean, I think there's a couple of things that you mentioned that stands out for me. The one, I can't agree with you more. Culture is an outcome, right? I often get the question around, what is the silver bullet that's going to change our culture? Well, bad news, there isn't one. There's so many little things that need to work in unison to create a systemic change. I think the thing that you've mentioned around the fact that strategy and culture needs to coexist. And, I've always thought about them that the one enables the other, but the relationship is multi-directional. You can get a strategy that drives a particular type of culture. You get a typical culture that can enable a particular type of strategy. And I think it's important to view them in that light. And then your point around that it's all about behaviors and how behaviors translate into real action. And then let leaders really set the tone. I mean, if we look at a lot of the research on how culture setting works, it's very much tied to the morals and the beliefs that leaders then also role model within the organization to a large extent. Ed, I want to bring us back slightly to the strategy point that you've made around adaptive strategy, and I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment. So as a leader, how do I make sure that I'm still steering my organization in the right strategic direction when everything around me is uncertain and I don't know whether I'm taking the right decision or not.
No, certainly. When we look at decision making, the big enemies of decision making, it's the volatility, the uncertainty, the complexity, the ambiguity, the VUCA, as an old military acronym that we used. And being able to address that comes down to two things. It's really knowledge and organization. For leaders, the more you know, the better. And what's going to really upset the apple cart in those uncertain situations and those ambiguous situations is the things you don't know. Things that you don't know, what surprises you. And so being able to eliminate that as much as possible and being comfortable with a certain level of ambiguity, with a certain level of complexity. And the great leaders are the ones that are able to still act in that situation, that are still able to make a decision, that are still able to create resonance within their organization. And they have the calm head amongst all of the storm. To get that is knowledge and being confident. And I have looked at this situation as holistically as possible. I understand where all the pieces are. And I've practiced making tougher decisions within calmer environments or within areas where I can have the time so that when the time crunch comes or when that complexity rears its head and more instantaneous decision is made, you can still keep that confidence. The other side is the organization and being able to say, here's all the knowledge we have, here's what we're missing, here's what's urgent, here's what's important, and being able to really dive into that piece of understanding and being able to dissect the uncertainty. Yes, there's uncertainty in the world. What are we uncertain about? What disruptions do we see coming into our industry? How do we see our customer tastes changing? And doing the due diligence, doing the research, taking the time to understand, talking to the people in our organization that are more customer facing so that we have a more direct feedback into that, for example.
Yeah. And I definitely think there's the old saying of knowledge is power around making sure that you are informed. Because I think strategy, to your point, happens in a context and it doesn't happen in a void. And I think very often in modern organizations where there's a tendency to be slightly flatter in our structures, it is more about connecting the dots and, being able to have visibility and sight of what the insights and the data and the trends tell us about, what's happening in terms of customer behavior and consumer behavior and things in our own internal world and reality. What I love about the point that you call out, and I've seen this a lot as well, is I think people get stuck when they don't feel comfortable that they have everything in front of them to make the decision. And for some leaders that I've worked with, this idea just on how do you make the best possible decision with the information that you have at the moment and be open and vulnerable enough that at some point, if the information changes, you might have to make a different decision. But you can't not make any decision. That's almost worse. It's a little bit this caught in headlights syndrome, right?
The worst thing a leader can do is not make a decision, especially when faced with that complexity and the need to make a decision. And that's where we tie directly into adaptive strategy. That's where we tie into those iterative processes. Is every decision we make is a learning opportunity. Now we've decided something, we've made a move. What's the resultant of that? What has changed? What hasn't changed? What was the impact? And using that impact, okay, what's next in the cycle? What happens? How do we adjust from here? And being open to that and being transparent about that with your teams. Being able to say, this is where we're at now. This is based off of all the information I have in front of me. Here's what we're going to do. And then let's revisit this a week from now. And what's changed? What has happened? Where are we? And this is, again, tying right back to my military past. This is what we did. This is how we operated. I mean, you have such volatile, uncertain, crazy situations there. And being able to act amidst that dynamic environment is make a decision, act, adjust, adapt, improvise, overcome. We had all kinds of great sayings around it. But it was absolutely take the action and learn from it and make it iterative. And the more a leader can be comfortable with that and being able to say, okay, we've learned something new, here's how we're going to adjust, the better.
Yeah, so Ed, bring it back for us to the organizational environment, right? Because and I definitely agree with you around the iterations. And I think in the past, strategies were always these long-term processes and cycles that stretched over a plethora of time. And then by the point in time when we kindly get to the whole cascading down through the organization, a lot of people would question, is it still the thing that we should be doing? What's different around the adaptive iterative process? What does that look like in practice?
In practice, it's feedback orientated, and being able to, the iterative process is driven by the learning modality piece of it. And so finding the rich feedback, being able to understand the new data as it comes in, going closer to the source and enabling more agency for people that have the ability or the need to make the changes faster. And providing the training, providing the support, providing the ability for them to build those job skills is a critical component for it. It's also, that's where I see a lot of the pushback I get from the executive teams is, well, we need to have the process. We need to have this. And that's absolutely true. We need to adjust the process. We need to be able to have people who are trained and skilled enough to make those decisions, to make those adjustments as needed. And there's a lot of risk there, because if they're not trained appropriately, they're not going to make the best decisions. But if they're not given the agency to decide, then the outcomes are often worse. So how do we build that over time? How do we enable that people and empower people to make decisions, and even provide the comfort and provide, for technical word, psychological safety for them to provide that level of upward feedback. Here's what we actually see. Here's what the report says. Here's what the data points are. But here's the nuance to that. And being able to have those frank conversations, provide that level of objectivity towards the senior leadership, who then can make a better decision based off of better understanding and better data. Because now we have frontline, eyes on, first primary data about the situation, about what's happening.
And listening to you, it sounds to me like you describe a bit of call it an ecosystem, right, that we need to create. And in that ecosystem, there's feedback, there's trust, there's information flows that goes up and down. There's still certain structures that we keep in place that make sure that things flow up and down and that we are able to have the right information at the right time. But it does sound quite a lot that it is built and based on this idea of co-crafting, co-creating, co-collaborating, and then making certain decisions, learning from it, and then trying something different. Ed, who does this well? Can you give us a practical example?
So a while back, I was working with a client, and they had a large remote team. And we had 12 people here in the home office in Boston, and they had about 300 across the rest of the states, mostly in sales and account management. But it was a frequent practice for them to bring a slice of those personnel plus the new hires back here into the home office. And it was rich knowledge sharing. It was, what do you see in your area? How are your customers talking about our products? What kind of feedback have you received? And being able to share that and share those best practices across the different regions, so that when people returned back to their areas, they had a couple new tools in the toolbox. So they saw some new best practices or some new ideas for promoting the product, or talking to customers about the new upgrade that's coming for their software. And that's level of resonance was created because they brought back the in-person, where the work was largely remote. You still had to have that hybrid element to create those relationships, to create the comfort base, to create the situation to make that dialogue happen. And they were very successful and very intentional about creating that. It was something that they defended that line item of bringing a few hundred people back here to Boston and flying them in and housing them for 2 weeks to do all of that. And that level of intentionality, I think, is the most important part of it. Is it's not what we want to find out, it's creating the environment where we can find things out.
Yeah. So I love the example that you've used there. And I think, your point that you make around it is about intentionality and knowing where we're headed and what environment do we actually need to be able to answer those questions, to make it practical, to make the calls we need to make, to move forward. Help us understand, how do some organizations get stuck? Because I can assume that it's not the norm. You and I can talk about it here. It's great, and that's the right way to do it. But for a lot of organizations sitting out there and people listening, they're going to say, oh, I wish my team was open to making these types of decisions. So what differentiates companies that get stuck in their old ways versus ones that are able to move into this way of working?
It's the risk aversion and it's the initial discomfort that sets so many people back. A lot of when I work with clients for the long term, those first couple of months where we enact things like this or where we try to open up the dialogue, it's the executives are very uncomfortable going down because what are they going to say and what are they going to think? And the workers are seeing the executives come down to their level and like, why are you here? You're the boss. And being able to bridge that and being able to say, yes, this will be a very uncomfortable process at first, but we want to keep those long-term mindsets. We want to create the culture over time. It's not a switch we can toggle on and off. It's something that we have to work towards. And maintaining that intentionality, maintaining the openness is a very difficult part of that. Mm-hmm. For me, it's, providing those little steps. And it's once we get a piece of feedback and we see something actionable and we see something that can be improved, implementing that right away and sharing it. That's how, and over time, you get enough of those little wins where you start to build the comfort level, where you start to build the resonance, where you start to say, oh, where it sort of takes away the mystique, especially from the line employees or the lower within the organization, that their feedback is recognized, where they start to feel the agency and they start to see a result of being able to do that. And that's sort of the second area where people get trapped, is if people give feedback, but they don't see a result of it. That just leads to frustration and it leads to disenchantment with the whole system. And so you have to be able to provide that. The same thing is if things don't change or if people provide some feedback that doesn't quite take it in the right direction or isn't as actionable because it's something that's been tried before, being transparent about that and saying, we've tried this before. It hasn't worked in the past. This time might be different. What do we need to do differently, though, versus what was done in the past?
It also, it feels to me, and it's something that I've spoken to a lot of clients about, that there's this, idea that the collective wisdom of the organization lies across the organization, right? And it's not usually encapsulated within the boardroom or the strategic leadership. I sometimes smile, and I mean, it's more relevant in the HR world when, most of the decisions that is going to influence the people in the organization are made by people that are not representative of most of the people within the organization, right? And it's very often the same with the strategic leaders have to make certain calls about things that's happening to the customer, but they don't deal with the customer that much. We can argue about it, but that is unfortunately a reality, and their role is super important. So what are some of the practical ways that we can do to keep the strategy alive? I love the idea that you've spoken about, sharing the successes, being transparent, making people feel heard, making people involved. But what other practical things can we do to make strategy come alive and not just let it feel like something we have to do in the calendar year?
No, certainly. It's the more we can share it, the better. Sharing, not only, like you said, the knowledge base exists across the entire organization. The people that are going to be the most knowledgeable about your customers are the ones who see them every day. So being able to not allow the siloing to happen, being able to allow the cross-functional communications enables a lot of that to share. And so being able to, from that strategic perspective, when you are in that strategic role, the onus is on you to craft the relationship, because generally you're going to be the more senior person. Every junior supervisory mid-level manager leader that I've worked with, that's one of their biggest fears, is talking to the boss and providing some upwards feedback. And so the responsibility then is on that leader to start that relationship, to start crafting that bridge a little bit at a time, to help build that comfort, to help build that psychological safety, to help build that resonance where people are able to provide them objective feedback, where people feel open to giving them their 2 cents and saying, hey, here's what I've seen, and I want to make sure that you are aware of this within our customer base. Or we're having some challenges with one of our suppliers. They're starting to slow down a little bit. It hasn't showed up in the numbers yet, but we're starting to have some problems getting a hold of them. Or little things like that are going to help craft those strategies much more robustly in the long term.
So if I, kind of to take a couple of key things that you've mentioned there and to try to translate them a bit to my next question around how does HR help and guide this process, right? And I mean, I think there's definitely a big, strong component that I'm hearing around, how do we build mature leaders that are able to operate in this way? How do we create open lines of communication? How do we make sure that the information flows and that there's data available? But if I'm an HR leader sitting in an organization today that still has a very old traditional hierarchical culture on the one side, but also strategy process, where do I start to influence to get my organization more towards this point and idea of adaptive strategy setting? And what do you think is my role as the HR leader?
Oh, certainly. HR is a great role for helping implement all of this because as a staff element, they're going to reach across everywhere in the organization. They naturally have touch points with all the other pieces, especially on the personnel side of things. For HR, it's about being able to track leading metrics, not just follow on and getting exit interview information or things like that. It's what are the causes of turnover and how do we address that? For when we're going to implement training within the organization, it's not just about completion rates, it's about what's the impact of that training and what are the differentials that we're going to see coming from and building the stronger business case around it. Being able to provide that level of data and understanding and being sort of a cross-functional hub that is able to collect, here's what's going on with our people, here's how those checkpoints are working, here's the departments where we're starting to see stronger results coming out of because we do see more frequent manager conversations. They have the ability to track all of that, and they have the ability to track the outcomes much stronger, but it also requires the HR to reach out to talking to the operations people. What are the important pieces we want to see change for your organization? What are the important pieces, the KPIs that are driving your division? And how do our initiatives affect those KPIs? How do our initiatives affect those outcomes? And bridging that dialogue and being sort of the initiator there is a powerful role for HR and really encompasses their role as a staff element, their role as sort of that advisory element for the people in the organization. I mean,
that's also a different mandate, right? So, I mean, something that we promote quite a bit is in your strategic advisory role as HR and as an HR leader, your mandate in the organization is very different because you are a business executive first wearing an HR hat, right? And that means that you carry joint responsibility for the success of the organization and where we want to take things. It's not the old model where business is going somewhere. I need to make sure that we are enabling the business to get there. It's much more integral, co-creative, co-responsible type of model that we tend to drive. What I love about what you're also saying there is in that advisory role, HR does step up to the plate in a very different way. And HR does actually play a very different role with leaders about shaping the environment for strategy to happen and to start to occur, and playing a key role. And I mean, I know it happens in some organizations where HR actually facilitates the process of strategy over time. Now, whether that's adaptive and iterative, whether that's a little bit more, structured still in some of the older school models. I think it is an important role to realize as HR leaders that if strategic clarity is not created in the organization, that actually becomes a problem downstream in a lot of the initiatives that we're running culturally, performance-wise, etc. And it is for you to recognize that and then almost align the leadership around the fact that maybe I just need to bring the right people to the table to have this conversation in a particular manner and, make the key decisions. Because ultimately for me, and this may be a very simplified view of the world, but strategy is about what I say yes to and what I say no to, and how do I pivot along the way. And very often, that's what we pick up, I think, in the HR world is where there's no strategic clarity. People say, I don't know what I'm being measured on in performance. But, if we don't know where we're going, performance is quite a difficult thing to measure.
Absolutely. And you can't improve at what you don't measure. For the HR role, it's that sort of that cross-collaborative piece is something I love with the HR because in the end, organizations are people. It's a group of people going towards a common goal. It's just a core belief of mine. And for all of the fancy tech toys and tools that we have now, they're still just tools. And they're absolutely enablers and force multipliers. But in the end, the work is still getting done by someone. And being able to enable that person, being able to empower and give that person the agency to do the best part of their job and being able to show them, here's how you grow, here's what your career track looks like, here's how we can help you professionally. Just all builds that tie to the organization, that tie to the value, that tie to the strategy at that personal level. And once you have that in the culture, it's a powerful thing. Because then you start to see the loyalty, you start to see the ideas, the agency, the excitement that people can bring.
I want to build on that a little bit. And I want to go slightly left field with my next question. Right? How do I know in an organization my strategy is in trouble? What are some of the signs that I need to watch out for?
When I come into organizations, the common signs I see when the strategy is in trouble, I love the organizations that have been high growth and are starting to kind of plateau. I love that kind of middle market, late stage entrepreneurship type organization. It's initially that market plateau, and how do we keep growing is not just increasing market density or breaking into new areas. It's kind of how do we increase internal efficiencies. So you start to see that breakdown in communication. You start to see the siloing create where people will get a little bit more tentative about their piece of things. It's also sometimes a lack of transparency from the top where we start to see that stratification barrier come in where the strategy is up here and we have this great idea and they're almost, I don't want to say out of touch, but they miss a lot of what's happening at the ground level. And the people at the ground level are looking upwards, often going, well, what was the good idea Ferry come up with lately? And what's next? So it's being able to, those are the kind of common barriers that I see. And when we address that, it's the small little communications tweaks. It's the small little areas of improvement and sort of that iterative piece I try to introduce about what are we doing to enforce the collaboration and build out some of the conviviality. And it's a long-term process. It's an overtime process. It's definitely not an immediate change. But the trouble spots they're fairly common, and they're the usual pieces we see as a result of organizational maturity. It's stratification, it's siloing, digital barriers becoming more prevalent where you're not seeing the results. For the age of hybrid work, it's, people complaining because they drove for the half an hour commute into the office just to be there, plop into a desk, and it's something that they may as well have stayed home and done. But they're missing the value of coming into the office, and that environment's not being created for them.
What I love about what you're saying, it is that a lot of these things are normal people-related matters that as HR we do keep an eye on, right? It's about how work flows, it's whether the work design is still fitting, the org design is still fitting, the communication happening. Ed, thank you so much for sharing all your valuable wisdom with us. A couple of things that's really stood out for me from our conversation today. I think the first one is this idea around the fact that we need to create environments for strategy to become iterative in organizations, environments of trust, environments where people can feel safe to give feedback. We need to also build leaders that are able to operate in those environments. The second point that you made really around the fact that I think old static strategy approaches are no longer viable in a very uncertain world, and we need to help leaders make decisions with the information that they have available, that is kind of available to them during the course of that particular process. And lastly, really the role that HR can play in that, not only just in terms of getting people on board and guiding the culture process associated with strategy, but actually getting strategy in place and making sure that as an organization, we are able to really drive the success that we want to see and adapt as the world around us also starts to change. Ed, from my side, thank you so much for sharing with us the great work that you're doing. Where can people get hold of you and where can they follow the fantastic work that you're busy with?
No, absolutely. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the conversation today, Dieter. Best places to get a hold of me are my website, www.leadfromthefront.net. And we have just kicked off a Substack as well, where I talk about some topics in leadership and how we can integrate that into our organizations. And that's leadfromthefront.substack.com.
Awesome stuff. And for everybody, we'll also make sure that we share those links in the episode below. Ed, from my side, thank you very much for taking out the time and joining us today on the HR Dialogues. And for those listening, we will see you soon with our next episode. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.